In order to understand indirect objects, we first have to make sure we've mastered direct objects. In a sentence that has an action verb, you may find a direct object. You will only find direct objects in sentences with action verbs. You'll never find them in a sentence with linking verbs. There has to be an action going on. Sometimes that action doesn't get completed with a direct object. We call those sentences intransitive. So we're only focusing on transitive verbs now, sentences with direct objects. And a direct object is a noun that answers the question, what did the subject verb? And we substitute the subject and the verb in the sentence. So let's take a look at a sentence. We have a sentence that says, Johnny drove the red convertible. So first of all, we have to check, does this sentence actually have an action verb? And drove is an action, so yes, we do have an action verb here. Now we're going to ask ourselves, what did the subject verb? So what's our subject? Our subject is Johnny. What is our verb? We said our verb is drove. So now we ask our question, what did Johnny drive? And we're looking just for the noun. And the noun in the rest of the sentence is convertible. What did Johnny drive? Johnny drove the convertible. The convertible was red, but we're just focused on convertible. So in fact, the direct object is convertible. Once we know what the direct object is, we can move on to indirect objects. So let's take a sentence like this one. We have Ron Swanson tossed the Frisbee. And in this sentence, we apply the same rules as we did before for direct object. We're going to look at this and we're going to say Ron Swanson's doing the action, so he's the subject. Tossed is the action, so that's the verb. And what did Ron Swanson toss? Ron Swanson tossed the Frisbee. So we have a direct object here. Now we can add some more information to this sentence. And sometimes that information will be essential to the sentence and sometimes it won't be. So that's what we're looking at next. We have Ron Swanson tossed the Frisbee, and still we have Ron Swanson tossing the Frisbee, but this time it's to Andy. We've added new information here. And because this starts with the preposition to, this is called a prepositional phrase. Ron Swanson is our subject. Tossed is our verb. What did Ron Swanson toss? He still tossed the Frisbee. The Frisbee is still our direct object. But now this phrase at the end, this prepositional phrase, it doesn't serve an essential piece of the sentence. It doesn't give us an essential piece of the sentence. It is actually functioning as an adverb. It's telling us where the Frisbee was tossed, where it was tossed, so it's functioning as an adverb. And so it's modifying the verb tossed. Now, in this case, we have a prepositional phrase that's an adverb. But the thing is, with this word Andy, we can manipulate that in English. We can put that in a different part of the sentence. And that's what we're going to do here, and that's going to lead us to indirect objects. We have Ron Swanson still doing the action. We have tossing still being the action. And the Frisbee is still what is being tossed. We have Ron Swanson tossed Frisbee. Still the subject, still the verb, still the direct object. But now we can take this Andy and we can actually move it in English into a position here. But in order to do that, we have to get rid of the preposition to. So we're just going to say Ron Swanson tossed Andy the Frisbee. We're not going to say Ron Swanson tossed to Andy the Frisbee. That doesn't make sense with English syntax. So Ron Swanson tossed Andy the Frisbee. Andy now in this position becomes an indispensable part of the sentence, and that is what we call the indirect object. So if this information, the receiver of the direct object is after the direct object, it's probably going to be a prepositional phrase. If it is before the direct object, so if Andy is after direct object, prepositional phrase. If Andy is before the direct object, now we know we have an indirect object. So to summarize, to have an indirect object, the sentence must have a direct object. The direct object receives the action of the verb. The indirect object receives the direct object. So we would say, what did Ron Swanson throw? Frisbee. Who received the Frisbee? Andy. And so the indirect object receives. But in order to be a direct object and not a prepositional phrase, the indirect object must come between the verb and the direct object. It is a location thing. So yes, it must receive the direct object, but it also has to come between the verb and the direct object. Here are some sample sentences similar to the Ron Swanson one. In the prepositional phrase version here, the boy kicked the ball to Lori. What did the boy kick? He kicked the ball. Lori's the receiver of the ball, but since Lori is after the direct object, this is a prepositional phrase. There's your preposition too. And it is not an indirect object. However, if we switch that, move Lori in between the verb and the direct object, the boy kicked Lori the ball. Now Lori becomes the direct object. Same thing here. Alice poured some lemonade for me. For me, prepositional phrase. But Alice poured me some lemonade. Now we have an indirect object. The receiver of the lemonade is between poured and lemonade. I sang a song for my grandma, prepositional phrase. But I sang my grandma a song. What did you sing? You sang a song. And who received that song? Grandma. So grandma is your indirect object. You need to get yourself in the habit of figuring out who did the action, who received the action, who or what receives the action, and then to the indirect object becomes the who is receiving the direct object. Here are some sentences your classmates wrote. Actually, I'm one slide early on that. I had students practice writing their own sentences in class. And I did have to clarify here with these verbs that these are the present tense of the verb. This is the base form of the verb: give, throw, toss, show. But you can use any form of that verb with helpers to make that work. So you could say, Scott gave me a haircut, and Megan threw me a party, and other sentences like that. So you don't have to use, we could say, Mr. Eby will toss out the first pitch at the baseball game. So it doesn't have to be past tense, it could be future tense. It's probably not going to stay in this present tense, though. That makes it tough because we don't typically use verbs in the present tense like that. We tend to more often use them in the past tense. So I would encourage you to switch these over to past tense as you use them. So here's some sentences now, finally, that your classmates wrote. Josh tossed Jackson the ball. What did Josh toss? He tossed the ball, direct object. Received the ball, Jackson, so that in that position makes that your indirect object. Tim's grandma sent Tim a letter. What did Tim's grandma send? A letter. There's your direct object. Who received the letter? Tim received the letter. So that makes it your indirect object. Same here. I bought my sister lemons. We have an indirect object in sister. Mary read Jerry a book. Who received that book? Jerry received the book, not as a physical entity of a book, but as the reading of the book, the words out loud, like an audio version of that book. Connor threw Will the rugby ball. What did Connor throw? He threw the ball. Who received the ball? Will. By position here, you know that is an indirect object. Hopefully that's enough. If not, there's a couple other videos coming in a few more slides. But if you are ready right now, you need to move along to the Schoology assignment called Indirect Objects. There are some multiple choice questions, and then you will need to write a sentence on your own. Good luck. Like I said, if you need some review, you can go back through this video, or you can actually go forward a few slides in the slideshow, and you can check out Khan Academy and yet another video on indirect objects to see if that helps clarify. Thank you.